Beste Witrivier, soos jy weet, is ons jaarthema vir 2016 een oor die Koninkryk. Nou, Koninkryksjaar, en dit hang saam met hierdie diep tema in die evangelies wat gaan oor die Koninkryk van God. Net in die Matteus evangelie kom dit iets soos 32 keer voor. En dan gaan ek hoop jy geniet hierdie tema van die jaar so baie soos wat ek doen. Ek vind dit verskriklik leersaam en ek groei in my verhouding met die Here deurdat ons boer en op hierdie tema en meer daarvan ontdek. Ek dink so baie van ons het gedink dat koninkryk beteken die hemel, en dan soos wat ons dieper delf in hierdie tema, dan ontdek jy maar dat dit verwys partykeer na die hemel en ander kere ook na 'n nuwe bedeling wat kom, né? En dan kom net as jy dink, goed, nou het ek koninkryk, ek verstaan hom, dan kom jy agter, nee, partykeer is koninkryk nie net 'n nuwe bedeling nie, maar ook 'n bedeling wat nou reeds hierso op aarde aanbreek en manifesteer, en dan kom jy agter, maar partykeer het koninkryk, die koninkryk van God, te doen met die manier waarop ons leef hier op aarde, en ander keer net dan, as jy dink, goed, nou verstaan ek koninkryk, dan kom jy agter, nee, maar koninkryk het ten nouste te maak met 'n persoon, met Jesus Christus. So koninkryk is hierdie diep motief binne die evangelies wat telkens groter word vir my, en ek hoop vir jou ook. Iemand wat my baie beïnvloed het, is die Nuwe Testamentikus N.T. Wright, en hy het my baie gehelp om ook die evangelies op 'n vars manier te verstaan. Ek wil so graag jou blootstelling gee ook aan hom, en ek het sommer 'n kort video insetsel bymekaar gesit oor 'n onderhoud wat met hom gevoer is, en ons gee sommer volle krediet ook vir Harper Collins wat dit by wie ons hierdie video gekry het, maar ek wil jou sommer net blootstel aan hom, en mag die manier, die lens waardeur hy kyk na die lewe van Jesus, mag dit jou verryk en jou help in jou verstaan van die skrif, en ook vir jou geestelik sommer help om geestelik ook te groei. Geniet hierdie onderhoud met N.T. Wright.
This is Mickey Maudlin with Harper One, talking with Tom Wright at the Grand Duchess Bed and Breakfast in Red Hook, New York, talking to Tom Wright about his new book, Simply Jesus. You make a pretty provocative claim in this book that we're wrong about Jesus. How are we wrong?
I think we have diminished Jesus by trying to fit him into either the category of he was a social reformer who did some neat stuff and then died too young, or he died so that we could go to heaven, and what was all that earlier bit about.
What parts of our story about Jesus are wrong?
I think the most obvious thing that we can say right off the top is that the phrase kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven has routinely been understood as heaven, as a place where we go, or we hope to go, after we're dead, and that's where God is king, and that's quite separate from who we are here and now, so that for many Christians, both scholarly and popular, both left-wing and right-wing, heaven is really the name of the game, and then this earth is just the place where that gets sorted out as to who's going where.
So Jesus is not talking about how to go to heaven?
Jesus is talking about God's new world. This sense of there being something new, yes, absolutely. But we have belittled that, and our talk about going to heaven in the Western tradition just doesn't get anywhere near the idea of God's kingdom arriving on earth as in heaven. And that's what Jesus is about.
Tom, in the book, you talk about someone reading your work and realizing that the church has domesticated him and diminished our portrait of Jesus in some way. What do you mean by that?
For so long, the church has looked at Jesus and thought that those stories in the Gospels must really have been either trying to prove that he was divine or to show us how to go to heaven. The New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, are much more concerned with the question which Jesus was concerned with, which is how God was becoming king then and there in and through his own work. We've been captive to a diminished, domesticated, often over-spiritualized vision of Jesus. And it's
what do you mean over-spiritualized?
Over-spiritualized in that people have often lived in a world where something is either spiritual or it's earthly or worldly. And a lot of people were brought up with the words earthly and worldly as bad words. But the Jesus in the New Testament is into politics, he's into food and wine, he's into marriage and family, he's into all this stuff. For many people today, there is a fear that if God was really in charge, then God would be bullying us, because people's image of God is God as the big bad bully who's out to get us. And you have Jesus going around with people flocking to hear him, not because he was saying you've got to sit down, shut up and do as I tell you, but because he was saying, hey, God is becoming king. God's in charge now. So everything is different. And the way he was doing it was by healing and by having celebrations of this new state of affairs that was coming into being. I think we have diminished Jesus by trying to fit him into either the category of he was a social reformer who did some neat stuff and then died too young, or he died so that we could go to heaven, and what was all that earlier bit about. The fact that we put him into those two boxes is symptomatic of a much larger malaise, that we have not allowed Jesus himself to tell us his own story of what he was all about.
The reduction of the gospel to Jesus died for your sins so you can go to heaven is a way of diminishing or reducing Jesus' ministry so that it is mostly otherworldly and we can get on with our world today. And you're saying that his ruler and king today is a lot more challenging to our day-to-day lives.
His rule is far more challenging than we've allowed ourselves to imagine. I mean, one of the texts I go back to again and again is at the end of Matthew's Gospel, where the risen Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now, most Christians are quite happy to say, as in that Easter hymn, now above the sky he's king. That's safe. He can be king way up there somewhere. We'll run the world down here. Or if we want to connect with him, we go and say our prayers, we go to church, we do the spirituality thing. We have lived with this split level world, and even if we want to join it back together, we have no idea how to do that.
The idea that Jesus rules now is controversial, provocative, or challenging idea?
Exactly. It's scary because people have an idea of, quote, theocracy, unquote. If God is actually in charge now, we know what that means. Some mad clerics down the road are going to take it into their heads that they are the official spokespeople and they're going to tell us what to do, and we don't like that. This isn't just a theoretical thing about Jesus being in charge. This is the basis of the church's agenda. This is what Christians ought to be doing, ought to be studying how to make it happen that God is king on earth as in heaven.
One of the things you say about your new vision of Jesus is that he is the active king and ruler of the world now. And one of the problems is that the church is ignoring what he says.
The book we call The Acts of the Apostles is actually partly written in order to say this is what it looks like when God becomes king.
Messy.
It's messy, it's painful, the church sometimes gets it wrong, sometimes gets it right, and we've lost the art of figuring out how politics and faith, how church and society actually go together. The Anabaptist is always in danger, I think, of retreating to saying politics is always a dirty game, we just shouldn't go near there. And okay, politics always has the capacity to be dirty, but what I see in the Gospels is a Jesus who gets his hands dirty, in fact, who gets his hands pierced with nails. The stuff Jesus is doing, his healings and the feastings and all the rest of it, are dependent on the fact that he is involved in a project which can only be accomplished by his own death. And explaining, that's kind of really bizarre to most people. Even the death of Socrates, the great Athenian philosopher, his followers saw that as kind of exemplifying the noble vision of philosophy which he'd articulated. But they themselves would have said, we'd much rather it hadn't had to happen. Whereas Jesus' followers were quite convinced that the kingdom only really happens because of Jesus' death and resurrection. To understand that is really very difficult for us.
So you're trying to redeem the word theocracy for today?
I never quite know whether to try to redeem the word theocracy or not. I think I would like to. It may be too bad a word for some people.
But how does it not descend into a Charlemagne sense of ruling theocratically, in the sense of having the state enforce theology and punishing those who don't
Here's
disagree?
the key thing. One of the biggest questions that Jesus addresses in the New Testament is when James and John say, can we please have seats at your right and your left? And Jesus says, you have no idea what you're talking about. And he calls them, the other disciples, and he says, listen, the rulers of this world do it one way. They bully and boss people around and frighten everybody. We're going to do it the other way.